The moment Minnie Sawyer stepped off the westbound train in Laramie, Wyoming, in the spring of 1878, she felt the wind hit her face like a living thing, raw and honest and smelling of nothing she had ever known before, which was exactly what she needed. She had left Philadelphia 3 weeks prior with $42 sewn into the lining of her coat, a single carpet bag containing 2 dresses, a hairbrush, a worn Bible that had belonged to her mother, and a letter of employment from a woman named Mrs. Clara Hodges, who ran a boarding house on the edge of a cattle town called Delwood, 2 days' ride south of Laramie. She had not told anyone she was leaving. She had not left a note. She had simply walked out the back door of her father's house on a Tuesday morning while the maid was busy in the kitchen, and her father was still sleeping off the previous night's whiskey, and she had not looked back, not once, not even when the train pulled out of the station, and the city began to fall away behind her like a coat she had finally shaken off her shoulders. She was 22 years old and she was free, even if free meant terrifying, even if free meant that she had almost no money, no family to speak of, and nothing but a letter from a woman she had never met promising her room, board, and $4 a month in exchange for cooking, cleaning, and managing the front rooms of the Hodges boarding house. It was better than what she had left. Her father, Gerald Sawyer, was a man of considerable reputation in Philadelphia society and considerably less character in private. He was the kind of man who shook hands with pastors on Sunday morning and reduced his household staff to tears by Sunday afternoon. He had kept Minnie in a state of careful, suffocating control since her mother had died of fever when Minnie was 14. At first, it had looked like grief. Later, it had looked like something uglier, a man who wanted to own the only thing he had left and could not think of a single reason why he ought not to. He had arranged a marriage for her when she was 21 to a merchant named Gerald Forsyth, who was 53 years old, jowly, and who looked at Minnie the way a man looks at a piece of furniture he is considering purchasing. She had told her father no. He had told her she did not have a vote in the matter. She had refused again. He had locked her in her room for 4 days, and when that did not produce the result he wanted, he had threatened things she still did not like to think about. So she had left. And now she was standing on a train platform in Laramie, Wyoming, and the sky above her was the size of something she had no name for, and the mountains to the west were still wearing their winter snow even though it was April, and everything around her was loud and dusty and smelling of horses and coal smoke, and she had never felt so alive in her entire life. The stagecoach to Delwood did not leave until the following morning. She spent the night in a small room above a dry goods store, paying 50 cents she could barely afford, and she lay on the narrow cot and listened to the sounds of the town outside, men laughing, a piano playing somewhere far off, the occasional sharp report of a firearm that made her flinch even though she was quickly learning that out here, a gunshot did not necessarily mean the world was ending. It might just mean someone was celebrating something, or frightening off a coyote, or simply making noise because the West seemed to encourage noise. She was on the stagecoach by 7 in the morning, sitting across from a heavy-set woman with a baby on her lap who fell asleep almost immediately, and a quiet, sun-darkened man in a leather vest who tipped his hat at Minnie and then said nothing for the entire 2-day journey, which she respected enormously. Delwood was smaller than she had imagined. It was a single main street of packed dirt with wooden buildings on both sides, a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith shop, a small church that looked like it had been built in a hurry and never fully finished, a bank, a barber shop, and perhaps a dozen other establishments that ranged from a surveyor's office to a milliner's. There were cattle pens at the south end of the street, and the smell from them was something she suspected she would eventually stop noticing, but had not stopped noticing yet. Clara Hodges met her at the stage stop. She was a woman of about 50 with iron-gray hair pinned up under a sensible bonnet and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She looked Minnie up and down with the efficiency of someone assessing livestock at a fair, and then she nodded once, as if Minnie had passed some test she had not known she was taking. "You are younger than I expected," Mrs. Hodges said. "Is that a problem?" Minnie asked. "Depends on whether you work as hard as you look capable of," the older woman said. "Can you cook?" "Yes." "So, yes." "Are you afraid of hard work?" "No," Minnie said, and she meant it, because she had been running a household in Philadelphia since she was 14 years old, and whatever else her father had done to her, he had at least taught her that there was no work too demanding if the alternative was worse. Mrs. Hodges nodded again. "Good. Come on then, I will show you your room." The boarding house was a two-story wooden building at the north end of the main street, set slightly back from the road, behind a struggling kitchen garden that Minnie could already see needed attention. Inside it was clean if spare, with 6 guest rooms upstairs, a large kitchen, a dining room where the boarders took their meals together at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening, and a small room off the back of the kitchen that would be Minnie's own. The room was barely large enough to turn around in, but it had a window that faced east and the morning light came in clean and golden, and it was hers alone, and no one in the world knew where she was, and that last fact made it feel like a palace. She had been in Delwood for exactly 11 days when she first saw Abel Monroe. He came in on a Thursday evening, riding a gray horse that looked like it had been traveling hard, the kind of lean and road-weary animal that told you its rider had covered serious ground without stopping more than necessary. The man himself looked much the same, tall, somewhere around 30, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had not seen a razor in at least a week. He wore a duster coat that had been good quality once and was still serviceable, trail-worn boots, and a hat pulled low against the late afternoon sun that was cutting in sharp and orange from the west. Minnie was sweeping the front porch of the boarding house when he rode up and swung down from the saddle. He tied his horse at the rail and came up the 3 porch steps and almost walked right into the broom she was pushing, and he stopped and took off his hat and said, "Pardon me, ma'am," in a voice that was quiet and a little rough, the way a voice gets when a man has spent more time outdoors than in company. "No harm done," she said, and she stepped aside with the broom. He looked at her then, really looked, and she looked back, and something happened in that moment that she could not have described precisely, some small shift in the air, some almost imperceptible recognition, like 2 compass needles swinging toward the same north without meaning to. He asked about a room and she called for Mrs. Hodges and went back to her sweeping, and that was that. Or so she told herself. He took the end room upstairs, the one with the view of the cattle pens, which nobody else ever wanted because of the smell, but which Abel Monroe apparently did not mind at all. He paid a week in advance in silver coin, and he ate supper at the long table with the other 4 boarders that evening, a drummer selling patent medicines named Harold Finch, 2 brothers named Calhoun who were waiting on some land survey to come through before they could start building, and an older gentleman named Patterson who had retired from something unspecified back east and had come west for what he called the quality of the light. Minnie served supper. She moved around the table with the dishes, and she was perfectly professional and kept her eyes on the business of the food, and she only became aware that Abel Monroe was watching her when she had already passed him twice and had felt something each time, a warmth, like walking past a stove. She told herself it was the kitchen heat following her through the door. She did not entirely believe herself. At breakfast the next morning she learned, from the general overflow of conversation at the table, that Abel Monroe had ridden up from Texas. He had been working cattle drives out of San Antonio for the past several years, and before that had spent time in Missouri, which was where he was originally from. He was looking at the possibility of buying some grazing land outside Delwood if the price was right, and the water situation was what the land agent had described in his letter. He said all of this in a measured, thoughtful way, answering Harold Finch's relentless questions with patience and minimum embellishment, and Minnie noticed that he never volunteered anything more than what was directly asked of him. She recognized that particular habit. She had it herself. It took a week before they had their first real conversation. She was in the kitchen garden one morning, coaxing the lettuces along with more hope than they perhaps deserved, when she heard footsteps on the kitchen path and looked up to find Abel Monroe standing at the garden fence with a cup of coffee in his hand, looking out at the mountains to the west. "Mrs. Hodges said breakfast is in 20 minutes, she said. "I know," he said. "I wasn't in a hurry for the indoors just yet." She went back to her lettuces. He stood at the fence with his coffee. The morning was very clear and very quiet, which was something she had come to love about this country. The way morning felt like an actual fresh beginning rather than just the continuation of the day before. After a while he said, without looking at her, "You are not from Wyoming." "No," she said. "Philadelphia. Long way to come for a job cooking breakfast." She sat back on her heels and looked at him directly. "Is that a judgment?" He met her eyes and shook his head, and there was something in his expression that was careful and honest at the same time. "No, I came a long way for less clear reasons. I was not judging." She looked at him for a moment and then nodded and went back to her garden. He finished his coffee and went inside, and that was all that was said, but something between them had shifted another degree, like a door opening very slowly in a house where all the doors have been stuck for years. Over the weeks that followed, Minnie settled into Delwood with a thoroughness that surprised even herself. She rose at 5 every morning to start the stove and have coffee ready by 5:30, when the earliest boarders began appearing. She cooked 3 meals a day and kept the common rooms clean and managed the linen and helped Mrs. Hodges with the accounts, at which she turned out to be considerably more competent than the older woman had expected, having grown up in a household where she had been made to manage the domestic accounts since she was 16. She planted more in the kitchen garden. She fixed the back gate that had been hanging crooked since before she arrived. She renegotiated the terms of the flower delivery with the general store on the grounds that the boarding house's order was large enough to merit a discount, and she got one, which made Mrs. Hodges look at her with a new kind of respect. She was busy, which was what she wanted. Being busy meant there was no room for the particular loneliness that had been her constant companion for 8 years in Philadelphia, the loneliness of living in a house full of people, none of whom actually saw you. Abel Monroe, for his part, proved to be a steadier presence than any of the other boarders. Harold Finch moved on after 10 days to sell his medicines in the next town over. The Calhoun brothers got their survey results and went off to start their building. Old Patterson remained, quiet and contented and fond of his evening pipe on the front porch. Abel stayed. He had begun serious conversations with a land agent named Burroughs about a piece of ground 6 miles south of town, and those conversations moved slowly, the way all serious matters in cattle country seemed to move. He helped around the boarding house without being asked. She would come out to the woodpile and find that someone had already split the morning's wood. She would mention at supper that the pump on the kitchen well was stiff, and the next morning it worked easily. When she came downstairs one dark Wednesday and found that one of the kitchen chairs had broken under the Calhoun brothers' heavier of the two, she had left it leaning against the wall, meaning to deal with it later, and by afternoon it was repaired more solidly than it had originally been constructed. She knew it was him because the other boarders were not that sort of men and Mrs. Hodges was not capable of it. She never said anything about it directly, and neither did he, and this arrangement suited both of them in ways she could feel without being able to explain. The land negotiation finally concluded in early June. Abel came to supper one evening with something lighter in his expression, and he announced over the meal that he had signed papers that day on 160 acres of grassland with good water access from Delwood Creek, and that he would be building on it by late summer. Everyone at the table offered congratulations, and old Patterson raised his coffee cup in a toast. Minnie was coming out of the kitchen with a plate of biscuits, and she set them on the table and said, "Congratulations, Mr. Monroe," and he looked up at her and smiled, really smiled. And it was the first time she had seen him smile that way, not the polite, brief smile he used for social purposes, but a real one, the kind that reached his eyes and seemed to mean something. "Thank you, Miss Sawyer," he said. She went back to the kitchen and stood at the stove for a moment and put both hands flat on the work table and took a breath. She was going to have to be careful. She was not, as it happened, careful at all. Not in the way she intended. The following Sunday, Abel asked her if she would like to ride out and see the land he had purchased. He said it in the same direct, unadorned way he said everything, standing at the back gate of the kitchen garden while she was hanging laundry, hat in hand, and she thought for 1 second about saying no. And then she thought about the 8 years she had spent in Philadelphia saying no to what she wanted and yes to what she was told, and she said, "Yes, if Mrs. Hodges can spare me for an afternoon." Mrs. Hodges could spare her, partly because Sundays were genuinely lighter, and partly because Minnie suspected the older woman had noticed more than she let on. They rode out after the midday meal. Mrs. Hodges kept a horse she did not use much, a broad, reliable bay named Flower, and Minnie was not a strong rider, but she was not afraid of horses. And Flower was the kind of animal that compensated for an inexperienced rider with the calm indifference of a creature that has seen everything and been alarmed by nothing for many years. Abel rode his gray, whose name, she learned, was River, because Abel had found him standing in a shallow creek in Texas, and the horse had seemed reluctant to leave the water. The land was 6 miles south on a gentle slope of open grassland that ran down toward a creek lined with cottonwood trees in new June leaf. The grass was tall and moving in the steady afternoon wind in long, rippling waves, and the mountains to the west were blue and enormous against the sky, and when they stopped their horses at the low rise where the property's northern boundary began, Minnie felt her breath leave her in a slow, involuntary exhalation at the sheer beauty of it. "This is yours," she said. "It will be, once I get something built on it," he said. He was looking at the land with the expression of a man who has been carrying a plan for a long time and is only now beginning to believe in it. "Where will you build?" she asked. He pointed toward a slight rise near the creek. "There. Close enough to the water to be practical, high enough that the flooding stays below. I have a rough design in my head, nothing elaborate, a house that will last, a barn, some fencing." "It is beautiful land," she said simply. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "I have been looking for the right place for 7 years. She turned to look at him. 7 years is a long time. "Longer when you don't know what you're looking for exactly," he said. He paused. "I thought for a while it was just land, but I think it was more about what the land represented, a place that was actually mine, that I had not been given or assigned or forced into, that I had chosen." She looked at him steadily. "I understand that," she said, "more than you probably imagine." He looked at her then, and the afternoon light was full and golden, and the cottonwoods made soft sound by the creek, and something between them pulled taut like a rope drawn between 2 points. "Do you want to tell me about it?" he asked. "You don't have to." "I know," she said, and she found, somewhat to her own astonishment, that she did want to tell him. She told him about her father, about her mother dying, about the 8 years of managed captivity that had looked like a comfortable home from the outside, and had felt like a slowly tightening room from the inside. About Gerald Forsythe and the arranged marriage and her father's ultimatum, and the Tuesday morning she had walked out the back door and not looked back. She told him all of it in a measured voice without self-pity, watching the creek and the cottonwoods rather than his face, and when she was finished there was a silence that felt full rather than empty. Then Abel said quietly, "My father was a judge in St. Louis, respected, powerful. He had a plan for my life that was completely assembled before he thought to mention it to me. Law school, his practice, his firm, his standing in the city, his son as an extension of himself rather than a separate human being." He paused. "I was 25 when I finally told him I wasn't going to do it. He cut off every financial connection he could and told me I was throwing away everything he had built. I said I was throwing away everything he had built and keeping everything I'd built myself, which at that point was nothing, but at least it was honestly nothing. She had turned to look at him while he was speaking. Now, looking at his profile against that enormous sky, she felt something open in her chest that had been closed for a very long time. "We ran from the same thing," she said. He turned to look at her, and there was a recognition in his eyes that was so complete it was almost startling. "Yes," he said. "I think we did." They stayed on that gentle rise above the creek until the sun had moved considerably further west and the shadows of the cottonwoods had grown long. They talked more than either of them had talked to another person in a considerable amount of time. He told her about Texas and the cattle drives, about sleeping under open skies and learning the particular rhythms of working livestock, about the men he had ridden with who had become the closest thing to real family he had known since leaving Missouri. She told him about Philadelphia's particular social hypocrisies and about her mother, who had been a woman of genuine warmth who had married the wrong man and spent the rest of her short life making the best of it, and how Minnie had spent 8 years afraid of becoming exactly that. "You are nothing like that," he said. "You don't know me well enough to say that yet," she told him. "No," he agreed, "but I intend to know you well enough." She felt the warmth of that statement move through her like sunlight moving through a window, slow and certain and real. They rode back to Delwood in the early evening with the sky behind the mountains turning rose and violet, and they talked comfortably the whole way. And when they reached the boarding house and she slid down from Flower's broad back and he took the reins to lead both horses to the stable, she turned and said thank you, and he said the pleasure was his. And both of them stood there for one extra moment that neither of them was willing to cut short. Until Mrs. Hodges appeared in the front doorway wanting to know if anyone was planning to help set the supper table. Minnie helped set the supper table. She was smiling while she did it, which old Patterson noticed and smiled about himself, quietly, over his evening coffee. What followed was a courtship of the most genuinely organic kind, the sort that is not conducted according to plan or schedule, but simply happens because two people have found in each other something they had stopped expecting to find. Abel began staying closer to the boarding house on the days when he was not out at the land supervising the early work. He would sit on the front porch in the evenings and Minnie would come out after the supper things were done, and they would sit and watch the town go through its nightly routines, and they would talk or sometimes not talk, and both were equally comfortable. He brought her wildflowers one afternoon in early July. He came into the kitchen while she was making bread and set a bundle of them on the worktable beside the dough without particular ceremony, just, "There are a great many of them out by the creek right now." As if this explained everything, and then he went back out, and she stood looking at the flowers with her flower-covered hands for a moment before she began to laugh, softly, to herself, because it was the most perfectly unadorned gesture she had ever received. She taught herself to read the land the way he read it, asking him questions when they rode out together, which they did most Sundays and on some weekday afternoons when the work allowed. She learned the names of the grasses and what the color of the creek water meant, and how to read weather coming in from the mountains, and what the different sounds a horse made signified. He was a patient teacher, direct and clear, never making her feel foolish for not knowing things she had had no occasion to learn. He was equally interested in what she knew. He would ask her about the boarding house accounts and actually listen to the answers. He asked about Philadelphia and about books she had read. He was a reader himself, she discovered, which surprised her until she realized it should not have, because a man who chose to leave everything rather than live someone else's life was the kind of man who had probably spent considerable time inside books looking for alternatives. He had 3 crates of books stored at the land agent's office, having sent them ahead when he decided Delwood was where he was stopping. She told him once, on a warm July evening with both of them on the porch and the fireflies just beginning to appear in the grass at the edge of town, that she had been afraid she would be lonely out here. that she had left the only life she knew for a place she knew nothing about, and that there had been moments on the westbound train when she had felt the enormousness of what she was doing and had been genuinely frightened. "Were you?" he asked. "Yes," she said, "but I was more afraid of staying." He nodded slowly. "Fear is useful when it's pointing you toward something. It's only a problem when it's keeping you in place." She looked at him in the firefly light. "That is a remarkably wise thing to say." "I have had 7 years of writing and thinking to arrive at it," he said dryly, and she laughed, and he looked at her laughing with something in his expression that was so unguarded and warm that she had to look away. It was in mid-July that the letter arrived. Minnie came downstairs one morning to find Mrs. Hodges waiting for her with an envelope, which was unusual because Minnie had not told anyone where she was, which had been entirely the point. But the envelope was addressed in a hand she did not recognize, and when she opened it, she found a letter from her father's solicitor, a man named Aldridge, who had apparently located her through the employment agency in Philadelphia that had arranged her position with Mrs. Hodges. The letter was formal and careful, and it said, in essence, that her father wished her to return to Philadelphia at once, that the matter of the Forsyth arrangement was still very much alive, and that if she did not respond and return within a reasonable period, her father would be taking certain legal steps to compel her compliance. What legal steps those might be, the letter did not specify. It did not need to. She knew her father's habits well enough to know that he was entirely capable of making a great deal of trouble, even from a distance. She read the letter twice, and then she folded it precisely and put it in the pocket of her apron and went to start the breakfast, because the boarders still needed to eat, and the bread still needed to come out of the oven, and the world did not pause for anyone's troubles, which was one of the things she actually liked about the work. She told Abel about it that evening on the porch. She did not intend to burden him with it, but she had found she had no desire to keep things from him, which was itself remarkable given that she had spent most of her adult life carefully partitioned from every person around her. He listened to the whole thing without interruption. Then he said, "What do you want to do?" "Nothing," she said. "I want to do nothing. I am a grown woman. I left of my own free will. No legitimate court in this country can compel me to return to my father's household or marry a man I have refused." "That is correct," he said. "And if anyone arrives here with any idea of compelling you otherwise, they will find the situation considerably more complicated than your father's solicitor has apparently explained to him." She looked at him. "Are you offering to be a complication?" He met her eyes steadily. "I am offering whatever is useful and wanted," he said quietly. "If it is someone standing between you and trouble, then yes. If it is something else, you need only say what." The air between them was very still. The fireflies were out again, and somewhere down the street someone was playing a harmonica, a slow and lonesome tune. "Right now I only need to know someone knows," she said. "That is enough." He nodded. They stayed on the porch until the night was full and the harmonica had stopped and the town had quieted, and at no point did he say anything further about what he had offered, which was its own kind of reassurance. The sense that it was simply on the table, patient and available, not demanding any particular response. She did not write back to her father's solicitor. She had done nothing wrong. She owed her father exactly as much as he had given her, which was a comfortable house and an education and 8 years of diminishment, and the first 2 she could not precisely charge against him, and the last she intended to be done with entirely. Nothing more arrived for 3 weeks. When the second letter came, it was angrier in tone and made reference to her father's poor health, which she recognized as a manipulation tactic her father had used before, and which did not impress her now any more than it had impressed her then. She showed this letter to Abel as well, and they discussed it practically, concluding that there was still no legal mechanism by which her father could reach her, and that his health, poor or otherwise, was not her responsibility to restore at the cost of her own freedom. "He may still send someone," Abel said. "Then I will deal with that when it happens," she said. "We will deal with it," he said, and the "we" was quiet and certain, and she let it settle without commenting on it, because commenting on it would require her to address something she was not quite ready to address in words, even though it lived very clearly in her chest. The house on Abel's land began to take shape in August. He had contracted with a builder named Hector Reyes, a Mexican-American man who had been doing construction work in the Laramie region for 15 years and had a reputation for building structures that lasted and were correctly proportioned for the wind and winter conditions of Wyoming. Reyes was a compact, cheerful man of 40 who smoked thin cigars and did precise work, and had brought 2 of his sons to help with the labor, and Abel clearly respected him enormously. Minnie rode out one Saturday to see the progress and stood looking at the frame rising from the grassland above the creek with something she could only describe as wonder. It was going to be a good-sized house, 2 stories, properly constructed, with a kitchen that would be functional and a parlor and 3 bedrooms upstairs, more than one man alone would need, and she thought about that and said nothing. Hector Reyes, who noticed everything, caught her eye while his son was explaining to Abel the issue with a particular crossbeam, and gave her a small, warm smile that said he had drawn his own conclusions, and she felt her face go warm and she turned to look at the mountains and pretended she was studying the weather. "It is going to be a fine house," she told Abel on the ride back. "It's going to take until October to finish," he said. "But yes." She asked what he was going to do with 3 bedrooms for himself alone. He was quiet for a beat longer than the question strictly required. Then he said, "I have hopes it will not always be for myself alone." She kept her eyes on the trail ahead and said nothing, and the horses walked on through the tall grass, and her heart was beating with a kind of steady, warm certainty that felt entirely unlike the anxious racing she had associated with emotion all her life, and entirely like something she did not have a precise word for yet, but was beginning to want very much. The man who arrived in Delwood in the 2nd week of August was not her father. He was a man named Stroud, small and well-dressed and city in every visible particular, with a manner that combined professional courtesy with a coiled, watchful quality that told Minnie, the moment she first saw him in the main street, that he had been sent by her father, and was not going to be polite about his purpose for very long. He found her at the boarding house that afternoon. He knocked on the front door with the kind of knock that expects immediate admission, and when Minnie opened it, he introduced himself as a man in Mr. Gerald Sawyer's employ, sent to accompany Miss Sawyer back to Philadelphia. He said it the way someone might say they were there to collect a piece of luggage from a station. "I'm not going anywhere," Minnie said. "Your father is ill," Stroud said. My father requires me to marry a man twice my age in exchange for restoring his standing in society, and he is using illness as a tool to produce that result," she said clearly. "I am familiar with my father's methods. I am not returning to Philadelphia. I am sorry if that is inconvenient for your employment." Stroud's politeness slipped slightly. He said that she was making a mistake and that the legal situation was more complex than she perhaps understood, and that Mr. Sawyer had resources she might not be aware of. "Then he will need to explain those resources to a court of law," Minnie said, "because that is the only place where anything he wants has any power over me." She closed the door. Her hands were shaking very slightly, not with fear precisely, but with the particular trembling that comes from confronting something you have been bracing against, the body's response to finally using all the nerve it has been building. Abel had been in town that day meeting with the land agent about water rights, and she found him on the street an hour later and told him what had happened. His expression did not change much, but something in his eyes went very still and focused. "Where is he now?" Abel asked. "I don't know. He went toward the saloon, I think." Abel nodded. "I'll have a word with him." She put her hand on his arm, which was the first time she had touched him in any deliberate way, and she felt him go still under her hand. "Not on my behalf in any way that causes trouble," she said. "I don't need a man to fight my battles, Abel. I need to know you understand that." He looked at her hand on his arm and then at her face, and his expression was something she had not seen on him before, a kind of careful, deliberate tenderness. "I know that," he said quietly. "I want to explain to him the legal situation clearly from a man's mouth, since he seems to be having trouble hearing it from yours. That is all." She considered that. "All right," she said. She removed her hand from his arm. He noted the removal and she noted that he noted it, and neither of them said anything further about it. Stroud left Delwood the next morning on the early stage. She did not know exactly what Abel had said to him, but she suspected it had been direct and had included a clear assessment of what the Wyoming Territory's legal position was regarding the autonomy of adult women, combined with perhaps some less legal but equally clear suggestions about what would happen if Stroud returned. Stroud did not return. A third letter came from the solicitor Aldridge 2 weeks later, far more subdued in tone, indicating that Mr. Sawyer had been advised regarding the legal situation and would not be pursuing the matter further. It did not include an apology. She had not expected one. She put the letter in the stove and watched it burn. Then she went out to the front porch and sat down in the good afternoon light, and felt the particular quiet that comes when something that has been hanging over you for a very long time simply lifts and is gone. The Wyoming sky was enormous and blue, and the wind moved through the street, and she was free in a way that was no longer complicated by any asterisk or qualification. Abel found her there when he came in for supper, and one look at her face told him what had happened, and he sat down in the other chair and said nothing because nothing needed to be said, and she was grateful for that. "Abel," she said after a while. "Yes, thank you for all of it. For listening when I needed to be heard and not pushing when I needed space, and for whatever you said to that man, and for the wildflowers and the chair you fixed without mentioning it, and for—" She stopped, because she was beginning to run over and she had not intended to run over. He was looking at her with that careful, warm attention that she had come to think of as the most remarkable thing about him, the way he looked at her like she was worth looking at carefully and at length. "Minnie," he said. It was the first time he had used only her first name. She felt it the way you feel a door open onto something bright. "Yes," she said. "I think you know what I want to say," he said. "And I think you are perhaps waiting for me to say it plainly rather than around the edges of it." "I might be," she said, and her voice was perfectly steady, which surprised her. He leaned forward and his elbows rested on his knees and he turned his hat in his hands, which was the one gesture that told her he was not as composed as he appeared. "I love you," he said. "I have been in love with you since at least that first Sunday afternoon by the creek, possibly before. I am not a man who is given to dramatic declaration, but I find I cannot continue to not say this." He paused. "I would very much like to ask whether you might consider marrying me and coming to live in that house I am building, which I plan to be large enough for someone besides myself even before I knew who that someone might be, though by the time I hired Hector Reyes I had a fairly clear idea." She was looking at him, and her eyes were bright and full in a way she could not help. "You planned the house for me before you asked me." "I planned the house for the possibility of you," he said, with a precision that somehow made it more rather than less romantic. She reached out and covered his hands with hers, stilling the nervous turning of the hat. "I love you," she said. "I love you, and yes, and I have been somewhat desperately trying to be practical about this since July and have not been particularly successful." He looked at her hands over his, and then he looked at her face, and he laughed, a full, warm, genuinely happy sound that she had never heard from him before, and it was the most beautiful sound she had heard in years, maybe ever. He took her hands in his properly and held them, and they sat like that on the porch in the late summer light while the street of Delwood moved around them, unremarkable and domestic and entirely unconcerned, with the fact that two people had just arrived at the place they had been traveling toward for a very long time. Mrs. Hodges, watching from the front window with no pretense of not watching, nodded to herself with considerable satisfaction and went to start a special cake for supper. They married in October. in the small, still somewhat unfinished church at the south end of Delwood's Main Street, with the reverend who came through the territory on a circuit every 3 weeks presiding, and Mrs. Hodges and old Patterson and Hector Rays and his sons as witnesses. Minnie wore a dress she had made herself from fabric that had been the single extravagant purchase of her time in Delwood, a deep blue wool that the woman at the milliner's had helped her select on a warm August afternoon, when the choice had felt not entirely hypothetical. Abel wore his good coat, which he had brushed carefully, and a necktie that Patterson had lent him because Abel did not own one, and he stood at the front of the church with the calm, direct attention he brought to everything, except that his eyes, when she appeared in the doorway of the church, were so full of something that she had to concentrate very hard on walking straight. They said their vows in clear, sincere voices, and when the Reverend declared them married, Abel took her face in his hands with a gentleness that was somehow more eloquent than any word she could have chosen, and he kissed her in front of everyone, not briefly, and the little congregation made a warmly approving sound, and Hector Rays's youngest son, who was 9, said something in Spanish that made his brothers laugh and his father shush him. The house was finished by the end of October, and they moved in on a clear, cold Saturday with the first snow of the season just beginning to appear on the peaks to the west. Abel carried in the boxes of books from the land agent's storage, and she arranged them on the shelves he had built along the parlor wall, and it took most of the afternoon, and turned into a long, warm argument about the proper organization of books that revealed they had entirely different systems, and were both convinced their own was superior, and it was one of the most enjoyable arguments she had ever been part of. They compromised in the end, which she suspected would be the pattern of a great deal of things going forward, and which she found she did not mind at all. The winter of 1878 settled hard over Wyoming, and it was nothing like Philadelphia winters, which were cold but managed, contained within a city built to handle them. Wyoming winter was enormous and absolute. It came down from the mountains and filled the sky and turned the world white and still. The snow could pile to the eaves of the barn inside a single night. The temperature could drop past anything a Fahrenheit thermometer seemed designed to express. The wind could come across the open grassland with nothing to stop it for 100 miles and hit the house with a force that rattled every window in its frame. Minnie loved it. She stood at the east window in the mornings with her coffee and watched the land under snow, and felt a kind of fierce, particular happiness that she had come to understand was not just about the view or the weather or the house, but about the fact that she was there by her own choice, had come there by her own action, and every morning was hers to be in. Abel was a good husband in the way that the best people are good at things, not by virtue of dramatic gesture, but by steady attention and genuine care. He worked long hours building the cattle operation, which was modest in its first year. A small herd purchased on credit from a rancher outside Laramie who had known Abel's cattle work from Texas and trusted his ability to manage stock. He was out early and back at dusk, and in the evenings he was fully present in the way that men of genuine substance are, not absent behind exhaustion or distraction, but there, listening, interested, bringing himself to the evening the way he brought himself to everything. She managed the house and the kitchen garden and helped with the accounts, which she was considerably better at than Abel, who acknowledged this without any wounded pride, handing the ledger book to her in the spring with the brisk practicality of a man who knows what he is good at and what he is not. She took on the accounts entirely after that, and kept them with a precision her father's solicitor would have found impressive, had he any remaining involvement in her life, which he did not. She wrote to no one in Philadelphia. There was nothing she wanted from that life, and no one in it she missed with enough intensity to overcome the desire to keep it clearly behind her. She had made one friend there, a woman named Helen Darcy who had been kind and funny and whose friendship Minnie had valued, and in February of 1879 she wrote Helen a careful letter, a single page, explaining only that she was well and happily married in Wyoming and wished Helen well, and leaving no return address because she was not certain Helen would not feel obliged to inform someone of her whereabouts, and some old habits of caution are hard to fully leave behind. Helen wrote back. She had found Minnie through the same employment agency, which apparently was a simpler path than it should have been. But the letter was warm and funny, and contained no mention of Minnie's father and a great deal of perfectly observed gossip about Philadelphia society. And Minnie read it aloud to Abel at the supper table, and they laughed at several points, and she felt the last small tension she had been carrying about her former life finally let go. She wrote back with a return address. Helen wrote back quickly, and a real correspondence began, which was one of the better things about that winter. Another thing about that winter was the evening in late January when Abel came in from the barn later than usual, stomping snow from his boots in the back doorway, and found Minnie at the kitchen table looking at him with an expression he had not seen before. "What?" he said, reading her face immediately. "I think I am going to have a baby," she said. He stood very still in the doorway with the cold air coming in around him, and the snow on his hat beginning to melt in the kitchen warmth, and his expression moved through something she watched very carefully, surprise, and then a calculation she recognized as the adding up of all the implications, and then something that settled deep and full and warm. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took her face in his hands and looked at her the way he had looked at her from the door of the church on their wedding day, and then he put his arms around her carefully, as though she might be breakable, which she was absolutely not, and she put her arms around him firmly and pressed her face against his coat that smelled of cold air and horses and the outdoors, and he held on. "Are you all right?" he said into her hair. "I am very all right," she said. He held her for another moment. "We are going to need to get you to a doctor," he said, very practically. "In the spring," she said. "There is a Dr. Matson in Laramie who Mrs. Hodges says is capable." "In the spring," he agreed, which was the only sensible position given that Delwood was currently under 3 feet of snow, and the road to Laramie was not reliably passable. He pulled back and looked at her, and the look on his face was something she intended to keep in her memory for the rest of her life, the particular bright, grounded happiness of a man who has arrived somewhere he never dared quite let himself plan on. "I love you," he said. "Very much." "I know," she said. "I love you too. Now come inside properly and close the door because the kitchen is getting cold." He laughed and came inside and closed the door, and she went to put more wood in the stove, and the wind moved around the house with its enormous sound, and inside everything was warm and lit and theirs. The spring came in with the particular Wyoming explosiveness of a season that has been held back long enough, the snow melting fast, and the creek running high and wild, and the grasses coming up green with a speed that seemed almost impatient, and the sky opening into that endless blue that still made Minnie stop what she was doing occasionally and simply look. She rode into Laramie with Abel in April and saw Dr. Matson, who confirmed what she already knew and gave a date in late July as the likely arrival, and who seemed like a sensible and competent man, which was all she required of him. She felt strong and well, which was a relief, because she had no patience for being managed into fragility and had told Abel as much, and he had said he had no desire to manage her into anything, which was one of the many reasons she loved him. The cattle operation expanded in the spring. Abel hired a ranch hand named Jonas Webb, a compact and efficient young man of 24 from Nebraska who slept in the bunkroom Abel had added to the barn, and who was good with the horses and the cattle, and who did not talk excessively, which Abel appreciated. Minnie appreciated him because he was forthright and honest, and came to supper on Sunday evenings when invited and ate her cooking with the appreciative seriousness of a man who had been eating his own trail cooking for several years too long. She expanded the kitchen garden substantially and put in a proper fence around it to keep out the jackrabbits, which had been making free with her lettuces in a way she found increasingly personal. Abel helped her with the fencing on a Saturday morning, while she directed operations and Jonas held the posts, and the three of them worked together in the good spring morning light with a comfortableness that had grown naturally without any particular tending, the way the best kinds of working arrangements do. Abel was building the cattle herd carefully and well. He knew what he was doing in the way of a man who has learned something through actual practice rather than theory, and his instincts for what the land could support and what growth rate was sustainable were sound. They were not wealthy, not in the first year, not by a considerable stretch, but the books balanced and the herd was healthy and the house was solid and the creditor in Laramie was being paid on schedule, and that was not nothing. That was, Minnie would have argued, a very great deal. She made a final accounting of the situation one evening in late May with the books open on the parlor table, and the lamp burning and Abel reading in his chair across the room and the sound of the creek coming in through the open window. And she looked at the numbers, and then she looked at him, and she thought about Philadelphia and Gerald Forsythe and her father's house, and all the ways she might have been living if she had been afraid instead of more afraid of staying than leaving. "I want to tell you something," she said. He put his book down. He always put his book down. She was never something he finished a sentence before attending to. "This is the best I have ever been," she said. "I wanted you to know that, not just happy, better, more myself. I know that sounds strange." He shook his head. "It doesn't sound strange at all. I know exactly what you mean because I feel the same way." He paused. "I've been meaning to say something similar for some time. I was waiting until I was sure you felt it too because I didn't want it to be a comparison you felt obligated to match." She smiled at him across the lamplight. "You are a remarkably thoughtful man, Abel Monroe." "I have my moments," he said, and picked his book back up, and she turned back to the ledger, and the creek sounded in the evening outside, and the lamp burned warm and steady, and she was home. The baby came in the 3rd week of July, which was earlier than Dr. Matson's estimate by about 10 days, and came with the directness and lack of ceremony that Minnie had come to associate with everything real and important. She had been hauling water from the pump to the kitchen garden at 7 in the morning when she knew with certainty that this was going to be the day, and she had finished what she was carrying because she was not going to leave the garden dry, and then she had gone inside and told Abel. Abel had ridden to town for Mrs. Hodges, who had delivered half the babies in Delwood's history and was not remotely unsettled by the situation, and also for Jonas Webb to ride for Dr. Matson in Laramie, which was the plan they had agreed on, though Dr. Matson arrived with several hours to spare. It was hard work. She would not pretend otherwise or frame it in any way that reduced what it actually was. But she was strong and she was capable and she was not afraid of hard things. And by early afternoon she was holding a baby boy with dark hair and a red, indignant face, and an extremely firm opinion about having just been removed from comfortable darkness. Abel sat on the edge of the bed and held the baby while Mrs. Hodges fussed efficiently in the background, and he looked at the child in his arms with an expression that was so nakedly overwhelmed that Minnie reached up and touched his face. "Are you all right?" she asked, which was what he had asked her in January. "I am very all right," he said, exactly as she had answered, and she laughed, tired as she was. "What are we calling him?" she asked. They had discussed names at length over the spring with no clear resolution. Abel looked at the child and then at her. "Thomas," he said, "if you agree, after your mother's family." Her mother's maiden name had been Thomas. She had mentioned it once, in passing, in some story about her mother's family in Connecticut, and he had remembered it and kept it quietly, and she felt something move through her that was too big for the word she had for it. "Thomas Monroe," she said. "Yes." Mrs. Hodges stayed for 2 days to help, sleeping in the guest room that they kept made up, and Jonas Webb brought firewood and went out of his way to be quiet, which she appreciated. Old Patterson sent a note from the boarding house with a small bottle of brandy and his warm congratulations, which Abel shared with the doctor and Jonas, and drank a modest amount of himself on the porch that first evening, while Minnie slept with the baby in the bedroom. He sat on the porch in the July night with the glass in his hand and the stars overhead in their thousands, the way stars are in Wyoming where there is nothing to dull them, and he thought about the distance he had come. Since Louis and his father's house, and the locked-in future, and the long roads south and west, and the cattle drives, and the years of sleeping under exactly this kind of sky, without this kind of home to come back to. And Laramie and Delwood, and a woman sweeping a porch with a broom who had looked at him with those clear, direct eyes, and had been running from the same wall he'd been running from, and had run right alongside him into something neither of them had known was waiting at the end of all that running. He thought about his father. He had not written to him in 3 years. He was not sure if his father was still alive. He thought perhaps in the fall he would write a letter. Not a letter asking for anything or offering any capitulation, just a letter from a man to his father saying that he was well and had a wife and now a son, which were facts that existed regardless of whether they were approved of. A man could offer information without offering submission. He would think about it. He went inside and set the glass on the kitchen table and looked at the bedroom door for a moment, and then went quietly in and stood at the side of the bed, where Minnie was sleeping with Thomas beside her, and the lamp was turned very low, and the light was golden and very soft, and he stood there for a long time. He had been a different kind of man for most of his life than the man standing in this room now. He had been a man moving, always moving, which had been necessary for a long time because moving was the only freedom available to him. But freedom had turned out to be not about moving. It had turned out to be about choosing where to stop. He had stopped here. He was entirely glad of it. The fall of 1879 brought the kind of abundance that a first full year of serious effort can produce, if the effort has been correctly applied. The cattle were healthy, and the prices were reasonable, and Abel settled the remainder of his credit with the Laramie rancher, and came home from that trip with the paid-off note in his pocket, and a particular lightness in his step that Minnie recognized immediately and matched. Thomas was 4 months old and large for it, curious and vigorous in the way of babies who seemed to arrive already impatient to be doing things, and he was thoroughly adored by everyone who encountered him. Jonah's Webb, who had initially seemed uncertain about babies as a category, had within 2 weeks become comfortable holding Thomas, and within a month was making the kind of faces at the baby that capable grown men make when they have entirely lost any self-consciousness about it. Abel wrote to his father in November. A short letter, factual and clear, containing no apology but no accusation either, simply the information that Abel was well and had a wife and a son and a ranch in Wyoming and was content. He did not know if the letter would be answered or welcomed. He sent it regardless, because he was at a point in his life where he could afford to offer things without requiring them to be received in any particular way. He received a reply in January of 1880. His father had written 2 pages in the careful hand Abel remembered, and the letter was not warm exactly. His father was not a warm man in writing or in person, but it was not cold either. It acknowledged that Abel's choices had led somewhere, which from his father was the closest thing to approval the man had ever willingly offered. It mentioned that his father's health was not excellent. It said that Abel's sister Clara, who Abel had not mentioned in the letter because he did not know if his father's position toward her had changed, was well and had married a lawyer in St. Louis, which surprised Abel not at all because Clara had always been more willing than he was to work within the available structures. He showed the letter to Minnie, and she read it carefully and handed it back and said, "Are you glad you wrote?" "Yes," he said. "I didn't need anything from it. But I needed to have written it. Do you understand the distinction?" "Entirely," she said. She thought about her own father, who she had heard nothing from since the letter from Aldridge in the fall of 1878. She thought about what it would mean to write. She sat with it for a week, the way you sit with a serious question rather than rushing it, and at the end of that week she decided she was not ready, and perhaps would never be, and that this was also a legitimate position and not one she needed to justify to anyone, including herself. Her mother was 8 years dead. Her father was a man she had escaped. The wound of him had healed into a scar that no longer pulled at her except occasionally, and she intended to let it remain a scar. She was building something forward, not backward. She was allowed to build forward. The year 1880 moved through its seasons with the quality of a life well lived, which is to say that it was not dramatic in the ways that make for exciting stories, but was full in the ways that make for actual happiness. The ranch grew modestly and soundly. Thomas learned to crawl and then to pull himself up against things and then, in the summer, to walk, lurching across the kitchen floor between his mother and his father, with the determined concentration of someone attempting a difficult task he has decided he will simply do by willpower alone, regardless of the number of times the ground rises up against him. Minnie took Thomas to visit Mrs. Hodges every week in town, and old Patterson, who was somewhat less old and somewhat more vibrant since having come to think of the Monroe family as his own in all but official record, told Thomas elaborate and entirely fictional stories about his past life back east that Thomas received with exactly the right amount of infant seriousness. Jonah's Webb had by now been with them 2 years, and was no longer quite a hired hand in the way of a man whose tenure is uncertain. He was closer to part of the place, someone whose opinion on the cattle and the land Abel genuinely sought and valued, and whose presence had gradually expanded from the barn bunkroom to the Sunday supper table on a permanent basis, and then to occasional evenings in the parlor, where he turned out to play a harmonica with some real skill. And Thomas found this completely mesmerizing. It was Jonas who was the first one out to see the rider coming in from the North Road one October afternoon, and who came to get Abel with a certain careful neutrality in his expression that told Abel it was something worth seeing before reacting to. The rider was a woman. She was perhaps 25, riding hard and badly, which is to say she was not an experienced rider, but was using the horse with the desperation of someone for whom not reaching her destination was not an acceptable outcome. She was wearing a dress that had been appropriate for somewhere that was not a Wyoming road and was not appropriate for one, and she had a bag tied to the saddle that had been losing items from it along the way. Abel rode out to meet her and brought her back to the house, and it was only when she was inside and Minnie had sat her down with coffee that she was coherent enough to explain herself. Her name was Margaret Bell. She had come from Denver on the coach to Laramie, and had been told Delwood was the nearest settlement to where she needed to get. She was looking for a man named Thomas Bell who had last written to her from a ranch in this territory 6 months ago and had not written since. He was her brother. She was 24 years old and had come from Virginia alone, because no one else was going to go looking for him, and she was not willing to simply accept the silence. Abel and Jonas exchanged a look across the kitchen that Minnie caught and read. "Do you know who Thomas Bell is?" she asked her husband. "I know he was a ranch hand at the Whittaker spread about 18 miles east," Abel said carefully. "I'm going to get Jonas to ride into town and make some inquiries about what the current situation is out there." The current situation, which Jonas brought back with the directness of a man who has simply asked directly and received direct answers, was that Thomas Bell had been injured in a working accident at the Whittaker Ranch in May, had been treated by the Laramie doctor and had recovered, but had subsequently had some dispute with the ranch owner Whittaker over wages owed, had been let go, and had last been seen heading toward the settlement of Elk Creek 40 miles west. No one had heard anything since. Margaret Bell received this information with the set jaw of a woman who has already crossed one considerable distance and is prepared to cross another. She was going to go to Elk Creek, she said. She had come this far. She would find him. Minnie looked at this young woman across her kitchen table with the eyes of someone who recognized herself in the posture and said, "You will need a proper riding outfit and supplies before you go anywhere, and you will stay the night here first." Margaret Bell looked at Minnie with eyes that were tired and grateful and determined in exactly equal parts and said, "Thank you." Abel sent word to the boarding house that he was asking a favor, and Mrs. Hodges, who had been known to lend things to strangers without hesitation if the cause was clear, sent back a riding skirt and jacket that had been left by a previous boarder and never claimed. In the morning, Abel gave Margaret Bell directions to Elk Creek and wrote a short note to a man he knew in that settlement asking that she be shown reasonable hospitality if she arrived. And Jonas checked the horse she had hired in Laramie and found it sound enough for another day's travel, and Minnie put together a bundle of food for the road. Margaret Bell stood at the door of the Monroe house with her improved kit and her exhausted, determined face, and she looked at Minnie and said, "How did you know to keep going when everything was uncertain?" Minnie thought about it. "Because the certain version of things was worse," she said. "When that is true, going is always the right direction." Margaret Bell nodded, as if this had confirmed something she had already decided. She mounted her horse with more confidence than the previous day and rode west. They learned from Jonas 2 weeks later, who had heard it from someone in Laramie, that Margaret Bell had found her brother Thomas in Elk Creek, alive and well if somewhat chagrined by the whole situation, and that the siblings had gone south together toward Denver. The report included the information that a young man in Elk Creek named Davis had been very helpfully attentive to Margaret Bell during her brief stay there, which made Minnie smile because the West had a habit of putting things in unexpected places. The winter of 1880 settled in with the same enormous authority as the ones before it, and the Monroe Ranch house held against it with the solid assurance of good construction and good stocking. They had laid in enough wood and enough food, and the horses were well sheltered, and the cattle had the windbreak pasture that Abel had fenced in specifically for the worst of the winter storms. Thomas Monroe, 1 year old and firmly of the opinion that walking was preferable to any other mode of transport, moved through the house with the proprietary confidence of a person who has correctly assessed that this territory is his. He had Abel's dark hair and Minnie's clear, direct eyes, and the combination produced a child of considerable personal authority for someone his size. There were evenings in that second winter that Minnie would remember for the rest of her life with the particular clarity of moments that are perfect in their ordinariness. The lamp burning, the fire going, Abel reading and Thomas asleep, and the wind outside making the house feel more interior by contrast, the kind of warmth that is itself because of what it stands against. She had been thinking lately about something. She brought it up on one of those evenings in February when the snow was deep and the world outside was entirely quiet. "I would like to do something," she said. "Something beyond the house and the ranch." Abel put his book down. "Tell me." She had been thinking about the women who came through Delwood, came through and stayed, or came through and were stranded, or came through not knowing what they needed and not having anyone to help them figure it out. Women like Margaret Bell, who had arrived cold and badly equipped. Women like Minnie herself had been, when she stepped off the stage from Laramie with $42 and a letter of employment and no clear knowledge of what the practical realities of life out here actually were. "I would like to start something at the boarding house," she said. "With Mrs. Hodges's agreement, something practical, information, supplies if necessary, direction. Women who are coming west alone or with very little often need specific practical help that no one is organized to give them." Abel was quiet, which was not the silence of not engaging but of actually thinking. Then he said, "That is a good idea. Mrs. Hodges will likely be strongly in favor. You would need some funding, small amounts but consistent." "I know. I have been looking at the household accounts, and I think there is a modest amount that could be set aside monthly without causing any problem. And I think some of the Delwood ladies would contribute if it were put to them correctly." He was looking at her with that expression she had come to know well, the one that was appreciation and admiration and love in equal parts. "You have already thought this through quite thoroughly," he said. "I have been thinking about it since November," she admitted. "Of course you have," he said warmly. She went to see Mrs. Hodges the following week with a detailed proposal written out on 3 pages, which Mrs. Hodges read with the same brisk efficiency she brought to everything, and then looked up and said, "I have been waiting for someone to do this for 15 years. When do we start?" They started in March, when the worst of the winter had broken and travel was becoming possible again. They called it the Delwood Women's Way Station, which was practical and accurate, and neither of them could think of a better name. It operated out of 2 rooms at the back of the boarding house, which Mrs. Hodges cleared and made available without charging any rent for the space, and within its first 2 months of existence, it had helped 4 women. One who needed direction to a proper employment situation, one who needed money for continuing travel because she had been robbed on the stage, one who needed medical attention she could not afford, and one who simply needed somewhere safe for 3 days while she figured out what she was going to do. Minnie managed it with the same thorough, competent energy she brought to everything, and she found that it gave her something she had not known she was still missing, a particular kind of purpose that was about more than her own life and happiness, however much she valued those things. Abel made a donation to the Way Station Fund from the ranch accounts every month without being asked, which she discovered when she did the accounts in April, and found a regular contribution she had not authorized. When she asked him about it at supper that evening, he said merely, "It's a good use of money," and went back to eating, and she looked at him across the table with Thomas in his high chair between them banging a spoon against the tray with enormous satisfaction, and she thought, not for the first time and not for the last, this is the man at the end of the running. This is what the long road was toward. The spring of 1881 brought a second pregnancy, which Minnie approached with the same practical calm she had brought to the first. Dr. Matson was known to her now, and the process was understood, and she was in good health and the ranch was in good shape, and there was nothing to be afraid of. There was, however, one afternoon in early summer when she was sitting on the back porch shelling peas with Thomas playing in the dirt of the yard, and Abel just visible at the far fence line checking something with Jonas, when a man arrived on a hired horse from the stage stop in Delwood, and he was wearing Eastern clothes, and he was old, older than she remembered, and grayer, and smaller than he had been in her recollection, which was what years and apparently genuine illness will do to a man. Her father dismounted from the rented horse with the stiffness of a man who was not accustomed to horses, and who was not well, and who was trying very hard not to show either. He stood at the gate of the yard and looked at her, and she looked at him, and Thomas looked up from the dirt with frank and uninvested curiosity. She stood up slowly. She put the bowl of peas on the porch rail. "Father," she said, not a greeting, just identification. "Minnie," he said. He did not look arrogant. He looked old and tired, and something else that she recognized with some difficulty because she had never seen it on his face before, which was contrition. She came down from the porch and stopped a few feet from the gate. She did not open it. "You should have written," she said. "I would have written back." "I wasn't sure of that," he said. "You could have tried it and found out." He looked at Thomas in the dirt. "Is this my son?" "Yes, Thomas." Her father looked at the child for a long moment. Thomas, unimpressed by the emotional significance of the moment, had returned to his dirt project. "He looks like you," her father said. "The eyes." She heard Abel coming across the yard behind her and felt him arrive at her shoulder and stop. She said without turning, "Abel, this is my father, Gerald Sawyer." Abel said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Mr. Sawyer," in a voice that was neither warm nor hostile, simply factual, which was precisely the right pitch. Her father looked at Abel and then at Minnie. "You are well," he said. It was not a question. "I am very well," she said. "I am well in the way I would not have been if I had stayed." He flinched slightly. Good, she thought, with a calm she had not expected to feel, not vicious satisfaction, just the mild rightness of an honest thing being received. "I made mistakes," her father said. "A great many of them, I know that." "Yes," she said, "you did." "I am told I am not in the best of health." He paused. "I do not say this to compel anything. I am telling you as a fact." She looked at him and thought about her mother, who had spent her short life navigating the gaps he left, and about the years after her mother's death, and about the locked room and Gerald Forsythe's jolly face, and about the train platform in Laramie with the wind in her face and $42 sewn into her coat. And then she thought about what she had been saying for months to women who came to the way station, that moving forward was always the right direction, and that living inside an old wound is still living inside it even if you are trying to get away from it. "Come inside," she said. "Have some water and something to eat from the road." He blinked, as if he had not expected this, which told her how little he had known her even at the end of their time together. "Thank you," he said, very quietly. Abel opened the gate. They sat at the Monroe kitchen table, the three of them, while Thomas played on the kitchen floor and the afternoon light came in through the window, and she served her father water and cold bread with butter and sliced meat from the previous evening, and they talked for 2 hours. It was not a reconciliation in any clean or simple sense. She did not pretend that the years had not happened or that his behavior had been anything other than what it had been. He did not ask her to. He said his piece, which included things she had needed to hear said aloud even if she had stopped requiring them for her own healing, and she said hers, which was careful and clear, and included the specific cost of what he had done and also the specific fact that she was not destroyed by it and had built something good from the other side of it. Abel was present through all of it, not intervening, simply there, which was all she had needed or wanted. Her father left the following morning. He stayed the night at the boarding house in town, and before he rode back to Delwood to catch the coach to Laramie, he came to say goodbye at the ranch gate. He held Thomas for a moment carefully, with the uncertainty of a man who has not held a young child in many years, and Thomas regarded him with the tolerant composure of a child who is comfortable in his world and therefore not threatened by strangers. "I am glad you are well," her father said to Minnie. He looked at the house and the land and Abel, and he said, "I am glad this is what is here." She nodded. "So am I." He left. She watched the hired horse carry him back toward the road to town, growing smaller, and she waited for whatever she would feel. And what she felt was neither the old anger nor an uncomplicated forgiveness, but something more adult and more honest, which was an acknowledgement that the man was what he was, and had done what he had done, and would live with that, and she would live with the having escaped it. And those were simply the facts, and she could hold both of them without being consumed by either. She turned back to the house. Abel was standing in the doorway with Thomas on his hip, and the look on his face that she would always love, most attentive and present and entirely for her. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. She walked back to the house and took Thomas from his arm, and they went inside. Her father died in Philadelphia the following spring, in 1882. The letter from Aldridge reached her in April. He had died of the heart condition that had apparently been genuine. She had never been entirely sure. She arranged for the appropriate legal matters through Aldridge's firm, which included declining the modest inheritance her father had left her. There were complications attached to it involving the Forsythe connection, which was somehow still entangled in the estate, and she wanted no part of any of it. She wrote Aldridge a clear and final letter, and that was the end of Philadelphia. Helen Darcy wrote with condolences that were warm and honest, and also included the news that Gerald Forsythe had died the previous year of gout, and had left his estate in some disorder, which Helen reported with more satisfaction than perhaps strictly required, but which Minnie read with a completeness of spirit that surprised no one, least of all herself. The second baby came in July of 1882, a daughter this time, born in the same bedroom as Thomas with Dr. Matson and Mrs. Hodges in attendance, and Jonah's waiting outside with a patience that told you something about his character. They named her Ruth, after Abel's grandmother, who had apparently been a formidable woman in Missouri, and whom Abel spoke of with an affection that said the name meant something. Ruth Monroe arrived with opinions already formed and fully expressed, and Thomas, now almost 3 and enormously interested in the new development, regarded his sister with the careful scientific attention of a child taking thorough inventory. "Baby," he said, with some authority from the doorway. Yes, Minnie said from the bed. Your sister Ruth. Thomas nodded seriously. He had opinions about names and apparently found this one satisfactory. Abel held Ruth the way he had held Thomas, with that same carefully overwhelmed care, the big hands with the new small thing in them, the expression that was still the same as the first time, still so full and unguarded that she watched him and felt the fullness of what her life had become press against the inside of her chest. "Hello, Ruth," he said to his daughter, very quietly. Ruth regarded him with the unfocused but total attention of the newborn. "She has your stubbornness already," Abel said. "She has been here 4 hours," Minnie said. "I can tell," he said, and looked at Minnie with a smile that was entirely for her, and she laughed, and outside the window the summer afternoon was full of light. The years after that were the years of building, slow and solid and steady, the way good things are built. The Monroe Ranch became known in the Delwood territory as a well-run operation, not the largest, not the most dramatic, but sound and consistent. The kind of place that outlasts the flashy operations, because it is based on genuine knowledge and correct judgment rather than ambition beyond means. Abel added acreage twice more in careful increments, bringing the total to 480 acres by 1885, all of it paid for clean. Thomas grew into a boy of serious disposition and considerable capability, following his father around the ranch with the intensity of someone who is always trying to understand how things work, asking questions that required real answers, and receiving them. Ruth grew into her early opinions and then some, with a brightness and directness that made old Patterson, who lived to see her learn to walk and then declare that she intended to ride by her 3rd birthday, say that she was her mother's daughter through and through, which was the highest compliment he knew how to pay. The Delwood Women's Way Station continued and expanded through those years under Minnie's management, eventually receiving a small formal grant from the territorial government when women's welfare became a matter of increasing administrative attention, and helping, by Minnie's careful records, more than 60 women in its first 5 years of operation. She was proud of this in a clean, uncomplicated way. It was work she had built from nothing based on a real need she had seen, and it continued to meet that need, and the evidence was in the records and in the letters she occasionally received from women who had passed through and landed somewhere good. Mrs. Hodges retired from the boarding house in 1884 and sold it to a couple from Missouri named Tanner, and she moved to a small cottage at the edge of town and was a regular visitor at the Monroe Ranch, where Thomas and Ruth regarded her as a household institution and one of the fixed points of their world. Old Patterson passed in the winter of 1885, peacefully, and in his own room at the boarding house, now the Tanner's establishment, and he left a small wooden box to Minnie that contained a collection of ambrotypes of American Western landscapes that he had gathered over his years in Wyoming and which were of considerable beauty, and a note that said she was the finest woman he had known since his own wife who had died before he had the sense to appreciate her as much as he should have, which she received and wept over and then framed on the parlor wall, where she could see it from the chair she sat in the evenings. Jonas Webb left the Monroe Ranch in 1886, not because anything had changed between him and the family, but because he had come into some money from a deceased uncle in Nebraska and had decided to start his own small operation, a decision Abel supported fully and marked with the gift of 2 good horses, and a piece of advice about water rights that Jonas later said saved him a great deal of trouble. Jonas's ranch was 30 miles north, and he remained a regular visitor, and something close enough to family that the distinction between hired and otherwise had long since ceased to mean anything. Abel's father died in St. Louis in the spring of 1887. They had maintained a minimal but real correspondence for the 7 years since Abel had first written, and his father had in later letters, perhaps as age and illness loosened things, said some things that came closer to acknowledgement than he had ever managed in his living presence. Abel read the news of his death from a letter sent by his sister Clara, who had included a note of her own saying that she hoped Abel was well, and that she thought of him, and that perhaps someday they might manage to be in the same place, which they hadn't been for 12 years. He was quiet for a day after that letter. She let him be quiet and was simply around, available, not pushing. Then in the evening he found her in the kitchen and sat at the table and said, "I think I would like to write to Clara." "Yes," Minnie said, "you should." He wrote that night, a long letter, and Clara wrote back with an equal length and warmth, and a correspondence began that within 2 years had produced an actual visit. Clara and her husband, a decent quiet lawyer named Ellsworth, coming by train to Laramie and then stage to Delwood and staying for 2 weeks at the Monroe Ranch in the summer of 1889, which was the first time Abel had seen his sister in 13 years. Thomas, 9 years old by then, regarded the arrival of Eastern relatives with the polite skepticism of a Wyoming child for whom the East was a somewhat theoretical place, and then decided within the first afternoon that Aunt Clara was entirely worth knowing because she could be made to laugh very easily, which Thomas found both delightful and useful. Ruth, 7 years old and firmly of the opinion that all things should be investigated thoroughly, cross-examined Clara Ellsworth on the first evening with a directness that made Clara look at Minnie with wide eyes, and then start to laugh until she could not stop, saying between gasps that she had not been asked that many questions in a single hour since the bar examination. Abel and Clara sat on the porch on the last evening of the visit after the children were in bed and talked for 3 hours, and Minnie could hear their voices from inside where she was finishing the evening's work, the quiet cadence of 2 people filling in years, not with grief, but with the practical inventory of what had happened and where things now stood. She went to the doorway before she went up to bed and looked at them there in the porch light, her husband and his sister, and she thought about running. About how far she had run and how far he had run and how they had arrived at the same place and how the same place had turned out to be here, this house, this porch, this family that had grown up from nothing she had planned but everything she had needed. She went upstairs. Thomas was asleep with the absolute efficiency of a child who has been thoroughly physical all day. Ruth was still awake waiting because Ruth always knew when her mother was coming. "Is father still talking to Aunt Clara?" Ruth asked. "Yes." "About what?" "About a long time ago," Minnie said. "About things that needed to be said." Ruth considered this with the gravity she brought to most things. "Is it sad?" "A little," Minnie said. "But mostly it's good. Sometimes the same thing is both." Ruth thought about that and then nodded, satisfied, and lay down, and Minnie smoothed her hair and said good night and went to her own room. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and listened to the creak outside and the murmur of voices from the porch and the sounds of the ranch at night, horses moving in the barn, and the distant sound of something in the open grassland that was probably a coyote and probably not worth investigating. She thought about a woman who had once stood in the kitchen garden of a boarding house in Delwood, Wyoming, with flour on her hands and a bundle of wildflowers on the work table, laughing quietly to herself at the completely unadorned simplicity of being seen by someone who did not want anything from the seeing but to see. She thought about the train platform in Laramie in the spring of 1878, with the wind off the mountains and the sky so big she had no name for it, and $42 sewn into the lining of her coat, and her whole life running away from her behind her and running toward her ahead, and she had not known which direction was which and had chosen to walk forward anyway. She thought about Abel Monroe, who had left St. Louis with everything running in the same direction, away from the life that had been built for him, and toward the life he intended to build himself. 7 years of moving through Texas and cattle country, and working his way to a piece of Wyoming grassland above a creek lined with cottonwood trees, looking without knowing for the same thing she had been looking for without knowing, which was a place that was chosen and therefore free. They had been running from the same thing, and they had run right into each other. She heard his boots on the stairs, measured and familiar, and the door opened and he came in and saw her sitting on the edge of the bed in the dark and came to sit beside her without turning on the lamp because the dark was not the problem. "Good talk," she said. "Very good," he said. "Long overdue but good." He put his arm around her and she leaned into his shoulder and they sat quietly in the dark bedroom with the creek outside and the children sleeping down the hall and the ranch all around them, solid in the Wyoming night. "Abel," she said. "Yes. I am glad you were at the end of the trail." She felt him turn to look at her in the dark, and then she felt him press his lips to the top of her head slowly, with a care that was all the more eloquent for being entirely unself-conscious. "So am I," he said, "every single morning." They sat together in the quiet until the voices downstairs were done, and the house was entirely still. And then they lay down in the dark, and the creek talked outside the window and the stars over Wyoming were there thousands above the roof. And Minnie Sawyer Monroe closed her eyes in the life she had built by her own choice and her own courage, beside the man who had done the same thing in the same direction. And she slept deeply, and without a single dream of anywhere else. In the morning she woke early as she always did, the light coming in gold through the east window as it always did, and she could hear Ruth already awake down the hall, talking to herself in the private, authoritative way she had, and downstairs the sound of Abel at the stove, which meant coffee was coming, and Thomas's footsteps starting to cross the floor above toward his door. She lay still for one more minute and let the morning come to her. The creek, the birds starting outside, the smell of coffee beginning to work its way up the stairs, the sound of her family assembling itself around her. Then she got up. She put on her dress and her boots, and she ran her hands through her hair, and she went downstairs to where her husband was at the stove and her children were starting to fill the house with the morning noise that was the best sound she knew. And she went to Abel and put her hand on his back, and he turned and handed her the first cup of coffee without being asked, because that was simply how they were with each other, easy and present and without the need for performance. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. Ruth appeared in the kitchen doorway with her hair entirely unmanaged and an expression that suggested she had already been thinking about things for some time and had conclusions to share. Thomas appeared behind her, taller than last week, which was how it seemed with him, like you could measure it if you checked too infrequently. Minnie set her coffee cup on the table and began the breakfast, moving through the kitchen she knew by heart, and Abel poured coffee for Clara, who appeared from the guest room looking considerably more rested than the late talking had suggested she would, and Ruth climbed onto her chair at the table and announced that today she wanted to learn to saddle a horse by herself. And Thomas said he had already been doing that for 2 years. And Clara laughed and said she was glad she had come. And Abel looked at Minnie across the kitchen and smiled. The breakfast table filled. The morning light filled the room. Outside the window, the Wyoming grassland ran out to the cottonwoods and the creek beyond, and the mountains were blue and enormous on the horizon, wearing their permanent snow on the highest peaks like something ancient and indifferent and beautiful. And below them the land was green and real and theirs, chosen and built and kept, morning after morning after morning, for as long as they both should live.